Welcome to the Fogwood Files, where fog lingers among the trees and the forest holds its secrets close. The Canadian Maritimes are a land of silence and shadow, where pasts dissolve into mist and voices echo without a source. Here, beneath the canopy of pines, people have witnessed things they cannot explain. Their words remain as fragments of a larger mystery, stories carried through the woods like whispers in the dark. Tonight, we open one of those accounts and step deeper into the ledger of the strange.
Case File 009. The Tide Stalker of Brine Cove. Date of encounter, April 2008. Location, Brine Cove, Nova Scotia. Report submitted, June 2013.
Brine Cove clings to the jagged Nova Scotia coastline, a small village of grey shingled homes leaning against the cliffs as if bracing for the wind and tide. The wharf stretches crookedly into the Bay of Fundy, patched with driftwood and remnants of old boats, its planks creaking under every step. The village smells of salt, fish, seaweed, and wood smoke, a scent that sticks to your clothes and hair and marks you as part of the cove. Each house tells its own story. The O'Malley home has stood for generations, its floors groaning with the weight of memory. The McLean family boasts a line of fishermen who survived the fiercest tides the bay has ever seen. Narrow stone alleys wind between the homes, slick with moss and tide water, leading toward the mud flats that stretch grey and treacherous at low tide. The mud flats themselves are edged with furrows, deep grooves older than any living villager. They mark the path of the Tide Stalker, a guardian of the tides, and they are sacred. Offerings of salted fish, rope, and scraps of cloth are left along the furrows, a gesture of respect that few outsiders understand. Even those who doubt the Tide Stalker tread carefully at the edge of the flats, aware that mockery or carelessness may invite disaster. Seasons shape life here as much as the tides. Winters batter homes and wharves, scattering driftwood and ice. Spring thaws reveal hidden channels, and fishermen prepare for the busy months ahead. Summer brings tourists, rare and cautious, who never stray from paths. Autumn is the busiest, with predictable tides, fish plentiful. But the work is urgent. Nets must be mended, traps checked, and boats reinforced before winter storms arrive. Stories of the Tide Stalker permeate the village. Old Tom speaks of fishermen taken when they disrespect the furrows. Margaret swears she saw a shadow rising from the water as a child. Each tale carries the same lesson: respect the sea, respect the marks, or be taken. The village endures, not just through hard work, but through careful adherence to the rules written in the mud, water, and the memory of those who have vanished. Life in Brine Cove begins before the sun rises. Fishermen haul nets and check traps while the air is still thick with mist and salt. The sound of water lapping against the wharf, gulls calling overhead, and the creak of boat timbers forms a rhythm that guides every moment. Ropes must be coiled correctly, traps baited, and lines repaired. Small errors mean lost catch, damaged boats, or worse. Women prepare fish for market, mend nets, and maintain the boats. Children help where they can, carrying rope, scraping barnacles, or fetching fuel, learning early to read the sea. Even the youngest know that mudflats at low tides are not to be crossed alone. They understand instinctively that the flats have rules, and the Tide Stalker watches. Each day is measured by the tides. High water brings a different routine than low water, and slack tide is a moment of tense observation. Fishermen memorize the patterns of the bay, how currents shift, how the wind carries smell, how gulls respond to changing conditions. No one disrespects the mud or the water. Even those who joke about the tide stalker cross the flats carefully, unconsciously following the furrows. Conversations revolve around the sea. Old Tom grumbles about weather predictions. McLean boys argue over the best bait, and the O'Malleys discuss repairs to the nets. Humor and rivalry are as much as part of life as labor, though underlying it all is a constant awareness of the unseen. The sea is generous, but it does not forgive mistakes, and the tide stalker enforces that lesson quietly, if sometimes violently. Evenings are for repair and reflection. Nets dry along the wharf, the smell of fish mingling with the smoke from wood stoves. Villagers leave offerings along the furrows, small gestures of respect. A salted fish, a scrap of rope, a piece of cloth. Children watch, learning the rituals, and older villages whisper stories of those who ignored the marks. The rhythm of Brine Hook Cove is relentless, but ordered, guided by tides, labor, and respect for what lies beneath the mud. He arrived in Brine Hook Cove one misty morning, carrying himself as if the sea owed him obedience. A young man from the mainland, loud, brash, and full of confidence. He stepped onto the wharf without glancing at the furrows or the rituals the villagers followed. His boots scuffed across the boards, nets, and lobster traps, barely earning his notice. I first met him aboard the boat during a morning haul. Old Tom muttered something under his breath. "Keep your eyes on the mud, lad. The tide stalker has a mind of his own." The newcomer laughed. "Sea monsters? Ghost stories? Please. No one with sense believes in sea monsters," he said, spinning the rope in his hand like it were nothing more than a string. He mocked everything. He spat over the side of the boat when we hauled in a particularly full catch. He stomped on ropes, laughed at the knots, and ridiculed the meticulous care with which we handled the traps. Every caution, every warning was met with a sneer or a scoff. Even the children paused to watch him, uneasy at the disrespect, instinctively sensing something beyond what they could name. We tried to warn him. "You don't touch the ground, boy, not even with your shadow," I said, nodding towards the furrows etched across the mud flats. He merely laughed and wagged a finger. "What, these grooves? Stupid fish and ghost stories. I've fished plenty of waters and none have scared me yet." It wasn't just me who noticed the danger. Every seasoned fisherman murmured cautions under his breath, glancing nervously at the flats whenever he ventured close. The O'Malleys muttered prayers. Margaret shook her head, recounting stories of men taken by the tide when they mocked the old ways. But he ignored all the warnings. Brine Hook Cove had rules he thought childish. Tradition he thought quaint. Respect he thought optional. Even on shore he flaunted it. He walked the alleys with a swagger, interrupted chores with jokes, and mocked offerings left along the furrows. He threw scraps into the mud, kicked at ropes, and laughed at anything the village considered sacred. At first we hoped it was arrogance or ignorance, something that might wear off with time, but the more he disrespected the cove, the more uneasy the villagers became. There was something in the way he moved, careless, almost daring fate itself, and every old story, every whispered warning began to feel more real. We knew the tide stalker didn't forget, didn't forgive, and didn't tolerate arrogance. But for our knowledge and warnings, he remained oblivious, convinced of his own invincibility. We tried to warn him, not once, not twice, but every time he stepped onto the flats or even joked about the furrows, the village spoke up. Old Tom, who had seen more tides than any man alive, cornered him one morning as we repaired nets. "Boy, heed what I say. Leave the furrows be. The tide stalker marks those who don't." The newcomer laughed and waved him off. "Stalker? What's next? Haunted nets?" You people tell stories to scare yourselves. It wasn't only Tom. The O'Malleys tried their own quiet warnings. They left extra fish along the furrows and mentioned, almost casually, the men who had vanished before him. "Better be careful," Margaret said, her eyes sharp. "The sea isn't kind to fools." But he only scoffed. He spat on the edge of the furrow one afternoon, laughing as the mud squelched beneath his boots. "You old folks think every bit of mud has a ghost hiding in it," he said. He kicked at a rope and swung a net over his shoulder, mocking the care we put into our work. Even the children whispered, watching him with wide eyes. "He shouldn't go out there," one said, tugging at her mother's sleeve. But the newcomer treated it all as entertainment, daring the sea itself with every step. We tried reasoning. "It's not superstition," I said once, pointing to the mud flats. "These furrows are older than the village. They're sacred. If you step on them, you risk more than a scraped boot." He laughed, leaning on a piling. "I've fished plenty of waters without paying homage to mud lines. I'll be fine." In Brinehook Cove, disrespect wasn't just folly. It was dangerous. Tales of the Tide Stalker weren't idle stories. Men had been taken before for mocking the marks. The air grew colder, the wind sharper when he crossed the flats, and the mud seemed to ripple under his boots in ways it never did for the rest of us. Still, he laughed and pressed on, dismissing our caution as superstition. Every attempt to correct him was met with mockery, every plea ignored, and slowly, unease settled over the cove, like a fog rolling in with the tide. For 3 days, the newcomer treated the mudflats like a playground. On the first day, he stomped through the furrows, laughing at the careful grooves carved into the mud. The gulls flew silently as he passed, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Old Tom muttered under his breath, "Mark my words, he'll learn." I wanted to drag him back to force him to respect the flats, but my feet were rooted by fear and disbelief. By the second day, he brought a friend from the mainland. Together they tossed scraps into the furrows, laughed at offerings of salt fish, and mocked the rituals we followed. The O'Malleys shook their heads as they repaired nets. On the third day, he ventured alone, emboldened by his earlier defiance. He urinated on the sacred furrows and spat carelessly into the mud, stepping deliberately where the Tide Stalker's marks ran deep. I was aboard the boat, watching from the edge of the flats, my hands gripping the railing, my chest tightened, an unwilling witness to what I knew was inevitable. Each day, the flats seemed to respond. The mud shifted under his boots in ways it never had before. Pools of water caught the pale light of the morning sun, reflecting the movement that didn't belong to him. The tide whispered across the flats, carrying a low, hollow hum that raised the hairs on my neck. We spoke less around him, fearing that our words of caution would fall on deaf ears, yet the unease grew with every step he took. By the end of the third day, tension hung over Brinehook Cove like a storm cloud. Every creak of the wharf, every ripple across the mudflats seemed amplified. The seasoned fishermen whispered among themselves, recounting every tale of men who had been taken, and I, standing silently, knew that the Tide Stalker had noticed. The furrows were no longer passive marks in the mud. They were a warning, and the warning was being ignored. It happened on a thin moon night, when the tide had receded far and the flats stretched like a gray plain under the faint light. I was on the edge of the flats hauling in nets when I heard his laughter echo across the water. That laugh, cocky, loud, defiant, made my stomach tighten. I knew he was walking among the furrows again. I should have run to him. I should have grabbed him and dragged him back to shore. Instead, I froze, gripping the boat's railing, watching. Every step he took was deliberate, mocking the grooves carved into the mud. He spat carelessly into the furrows, kicked at the offerings we had left that night before. He laughed at the wind and the gulls, at the warnings of every elder in the village. The mud seemed to shift beneath him in response. Pools of water shimmered unnaturally, reflecting movement that was not his. Channels that should have been familiar twisted subtly under the low moonlight, as if rearranging themselves to ensnare him. The air grew colder, carrying a hollow hum that rolled across the flats. Then I saw it. A dark, fluid form rose from the edge of the water, moving upright like smoke, yet shaped like a serpent. It circled him slowly, deliberately. The Tide Stalker did not rush. It did not strike. It measured. It waited. Respect or be taken. He laughed at first, but the laughter faltered as the air thickened, as the mud beneath his boots seemed to pull at him. Every tale we had ever told him came rushing into my mind. I was rooted in place, helpless, a witness to what I knew was coming. The Tide Stalker's form glided closer. Water and mud swirled around him, rising in unnatural patterns that seemed ritualistic, almost ceremonial. His laughter turned into a scream, sharp, raw, echoing across the flats. I heard the pull of the mud, the sucking sound of water mingling with the tide, dragging him inch by inch toward the channels where the furrows ended. His cries for help echoed over the flats, and then he was gone. The screaming ceased abruptly, leaving only the whisper of the tide and the low hum that seemed to resonate from the mud itself. The flats settled as if nothing had happened. I stood frozen, chest heaving, knowing that I had witnessed what generations of villagers feared, and that nothing would ever make sense the same way again. The flats fell silent after his scream. Only the distant slap of water against the wharf broke the stillness. I watched, heart hammering as the mud seemed to breathe, the furrows glowing faintly under the moonlight. The newcomer was gone, swallowed, claimed, but the scene remained, unnervingly intact, as if the flats themselves were untouched. I staggered closer, unable to stop myself, and saw the water swirling in unnatural patterns. Channels I had walked safely for decades seemed to coil and twist, guiding the tides like hands moving deliberately. The offerings I had left along the furrows, the salted fish, the scraps of rope, the tiny cloth flags, were undisturbed, yet every groove of the mud seemed sharpened, deepened, as though the Tide Stalker had reinforced its warning. The air was thick, pressing against my chest. The Tide Stalker did not linger. It had no need. Its presence remained in the mud, in the swell of the water, in the hum that vibrated through the flats. The newcomer's footprints had vanished entirely, erased as if he had never existed. Only the grooves remained, twisted and intricate, marking the path he had mocked, and the finality of his arrogance. I understood that the Tide Stalker did not hunt in anger. It enforced the rules of the flats. It measured disrespect and claimed only those who defied what generations of knowledge had preserved. The lesson was clear. The sea does not forgive. By the time I returned to the village, the news was already spreading. The newcomer had been claimed, and we were left to reckon with the weight of that event, the reinforced warning that the flats were not to be mocked. The day after the disappearance, the village moved quietly, almost reverently, as though the flats themselves had demanded a subdued mood. Boats remained tied to the wharf longer than usual, nets hung untouched, and the air was thick with unspoken fear. Conversations were hushed. The disappearance became a quiet lesson, retold not with anger, but with somber weight that settled over everyone, like the fog that often rolled in from the bay. At night, I could still hear the echo of that final scream in my mind, carried faintly on the tide. Sleep was fitful, dreams haunted by dark, fluid shapes moving beneath the mud. Every creak of the wharf, every slap of the water against pilings, reminded me that the tide stalker had acted, and the consequences of disrespect were permanent. And I, who had watched helplessly, carried the heaviest burden. Guilt and fear lingered, a constant reminder that I should have acted. Instead, I had been a witness, and the lesson of Brine Hook Cove had been carved into the mud, the tide, and my very soul. I write this not for fame, not for disbelief, but as a confession, a reckoning. The story of what happened on the mudflats of Brine Hook Cove is mine to bear, and it is mine alone to recount. I should have acted. Instead, I watched, and for that, the memory haunts me every day. I saw the tide stalker claim him. I cannot describe it fully. The shape, the fluidity, the ritual of the movements, but I can assure you, it exists. The tide stalker is not evil, not a mindless predator. It is a guardian, a force older than the village itself, enforcing rules written in the grooves of the flats, in the cycles of the tide, in the memory of the fishermen who came before us. Disrespect, mockery, or carelessness invites consequences. So let this be a warning to anyone who doubts the stories. The furrows are real. The stalker is real. The tide is patient and the mud is merciless. Respect the ocean. Respect the marks, or you may find yourself taken, like the newcomer, and no one will hear your laughter again. I write this confession for those who still think the tales are just tales, for those who may wander too far on the flats or scoff at the wisdom of generations. Take heed. The ocean keeps its own score, and the tide walker ensures that it is never forgotten. End of report.
This report submitted by the Fogwood Files, another account pulled from the fog and preserved in the records. If you'd like the next story to find its way to you, be sure to like and subscribe so you'll be here when the next fire is lit. Until then, stay close to the firelight, because in the woods, you're never truly alone, and something is always waiting just beyond the glow.